Welcome back to the Art of the Startup Pivot, the podcast exploring those critical moments when companies completely change direction and, against all odds, find monumental success. Today, Sam, we're diving into a story that truly embodies this idea: how a failed online game paved the way for a global communication powerhouse.
That's right, Alex. It's one of the most compelling pivot stories out there. We're talking about the journey from a whimsical online multiplayer game called Glitch, which ultimately failed, to the creation of Slack, a platform that was later acquired by Salesforce for a staggering $27 billion. It's a classic example of how the most valuable product can often emerge from a seemingly unrelated internal need.
That's a massive leap. Before we get into the specifics, can you briefly remind our listeners what a startup pivot truly entails?
Absolutely. A startup pivot isn't a sign of failure. It's a fundamental strategic redirection. It's when an entrepreneurial company significantly modifies its business concept, product offering, or core business model to better align with market needs and opportunities. It's a calculated experiment to test new hypotheses about growth and market potential, often driven by insights from customer feedback, market evolution, or competitive pressures. Research indicates that approximately 80% of startups change their product or strategy before finding lasting success, and around 92% of startups pivot at least once before achieving product-market fit. This isn't an anomaly. It's a common occurrence in the startup ecosystem.
So it's less about admitting defeat and more about smart adaptation.
Precisely. Initial hypotheses about product-market fit or target audiences frequently prove incorrect. The key to successful pivots involves decisive action, leveraging existing assets, and a willingness to abandon original visions. This allows companies to adapt and ultimately thrive. In fact, 75% of successful startups pivoted at least once before finding a viable business model. It's challenging, but embracing the pivot is considered essential for long-term success.
So let's go back to Glitch. The team, Tiny Speck, poured years into developing this game. What happened?
Well, despite the effort, Glitch didn't find its audience. It failed to gain significant traction, and the company was facing a critical juncture. It was a tough situation for the co-founder, Stuart Butterfield, and his team. They had invested so much time and energy into this creative endeavor, only to see it not take off in the market. This period can be incredibly stressful for founders, as they have to grapple with letting go of their initial passion project.
That sounds like a desperation pivot in the making, where resources are dwindling.
It could have been, but it wasn't. This is where the story gets interesting. During the development of Glitch, their distributed team needed a way to communicate effectively across different locations, so they built an internal communication tool. It was just a means to an end for their primary gaming project.
And this internal tool became the pivot.
Exactly. As Glitch struggled, the team started noticing how incredibly useful and robust their internal communication tool had become. It was efficient, streamlined, and solved a genuine problem they had. They began to see the potential beyond their own company. This wasn't a desperation pivot where they were floundering for any idea. It was a good pivot, driven by validated insights from their own internal experience. Stuart Butterfield and his team recognized this emerging value.
So they leveraged an existing asset, the technology they had already built for themselves.
Spot on. They made the decisive action to abandon their original vision for Glitch and focus entirely on this communication tool. That internal project evolved into Slack. It truly exemplifies how a company can pivot from a product, the game, to the underlying technology that enabled their own operations.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
Indeed. Slack went on to become an indispensable workplace messaging platform, and as I mentioned, it was acquired by Salesforce for $27 billion. It's a powerful illustration that sometimes the most successful product isn't the one you initially set out to build, but rather something that emerges organically from solving an internal problem or observing user behavior, even if those users are your own employees.
It highlights that a pivot, while challenging, can lead to incredible outcomes. The willingness to let go of the original dream and reevaluate based on new insights seems paramount. We've learned that 70% of startups that pivot successfully do find a viable business model, though 30% still fail post-pivot. But for founders committed seriously to the pivoting process, success rates are around 75%.
It certainly does. It also serves as a reminder that major pivots do incur costs. A major pivot can incur direct engineering costs of 3 to 6 months of burn, which for a typical startup with a $180,000 monthly burn rate equates to $540,000 to $1.08 million. But the return, as we saw with Slack, can be exponential.
The Slack story is a masterclass in strategic redirection. It shows how even when an initial venture doesn't succeed, the underlying technology or a side project can become the foundation for something truly revolutionary. Stuart Butterfield's experience with TinySpec perfectly illustrates that calculated experiments and adaptability are crucial for startup survival and ultimately massive success.
Absolutely, Alex. And it's a great segue into our next episode. Just as TinySpec had to reimagine its core offering, sometimes external market disruption can force a company to completely rethink its purpose. Imagine a podcasting platform that was rendered obsolete overnight by a tech giant. What do you do then? Do you fold? Or do you invent a whole new way for people to share short, impactful messages?
Intriguing. It sounds like another story of radical reinvention born out of necessity. Listeners, join us next time on The Art of the Startup Pivot as we uncover how market disruption can force a creative reimagining of a company's core offering. You won't want to miss When Disruption Forces Reinvention. Audio to Twitter. Welcome back to The Art of the Startup Pivot. Today we're diving into a story of dramatic reinvention, where market disruption didn't spell the end, but rather a new beginning for a company that went from podcasts to global social networking. Sam, this sounds like a fascinating journey.
It absolutely is, Alex. We're talking about Odeo, a company that launched in 2005 as a podcasting platform. Their story is a quintessential example of how external forces can necessitate a fundamental strategic redirection, what we call a pivot, and how embracing that change can lead to unforeseen success.
So, Odeo started strong in podcasting. What happened to force such a significant shift?
Well, Odeo's initial vision was to be a major player in the emerging podcasting space. However, they were swiftly rendered obsolete overnight by a massive market shift, Apple's integration of podcasts directly into iTunes. This wasn't a minor setback. It was an existential threat that effectively wiped out their core business model. It truly highlights how competitive pressures and market evolution can drive the need for a pivot.
That's a brutal blow for any startup. How did the Odeo team respond to such a sudden and profound disruption?
Instead of folding, the team, which included co-founder Jack Dorsey, demonstrated remarkable agility. They recognized the need to abandon their original vision and began experimenting. They worked on a side project, a system for sharing 140-character status updates via SMS. This might seem like a small idea, but it was a calculated experiment, a new hypothesis about market potential.
And that side project ultimately evolved into Twitter, which we now know as X, a global social network. It's incredible to think that a direct response to being disrupted could lead to something so massive.
It truly is, Alex. This story perfectly illustrates that a pivot isn't a sign of failure, but a strategic move. As entrepreneurial expert Eric Ries, who popularized the concept of a pivot, describes it, it's a structured course correction based on validated learning. Steve Blank, known as the godfather of the customer development model, reinforces this, noting that startups are temporary organizations constantly searching for repeatable and scalable business models, which often necessitates pivots.
It sounds like pivots are more common than people might think. Do we have any statistics on how often startups pivot?
Absolutely. The data strongly supports the idea that pivots are a common part of the entrepreneurial journey. Approximately 80% of startups change their product or strategy before finding lasting success. Even more strikingly, around 92% of startups pivot at least once before achieving product-market fit. For successful startups, the numbers are even clearer. 75% of successful startups pivoted at least once before finding a viable business model.
Those are significant figures. So while Odeo's pivot might seem extraordinary, The act of pivoting itself is a well-trodden path for many ventures.
Precisely. The Odeo story is a powerful testament to adapting under competitive pressures. It underscores the critical importance of being willing to abandon initial visions and leverage existing team capabilities and insights to explore new opportunities. Without that decisive action, Odeo likely wouldn't have survived. And while 70% of startups that pivot successfully do find a viable business model, it's important to note that 30% still fail post-pivot. This highlights that pivots, while essential, are not a guaranteed path to success. They require serious commitment.
That's a crucial distinction. Not all pivots lead to a win, but they significantly increase the odds. It also makes you wonder about the cost of not pivoting. What happens when a startup tries to stick with an idea that isn't working?
Indeed, sticking to an unviable idea is often more detrimental. A top reason for startup failure, accounting for 42% of cases, is a lack of market need for the product. And running out of cash is the second leading cause, affecting 29% of ventures. Pivoting, particularly a good pivot, driven by data and clear hypotheses, addresses these issues head-on. It's about recognizing that initial hypotheses about product market fit can often be incorrect, as they were for Odeo in the podcasting market.
The Odeo to Twitter transformation is a compelling example of how market disruption can be a catalyst for groundbreaking innovation. It really drives home the idea that embracing change is fundamental for a startup's long-term survival and success.
Absolutely. It's about being observant, understanding market shifts, and having the courage to make a fundamental change when necessary. The Odeo team didn't just survive, they thrived by reimagining their core offering entirely. And speaking of reimagining and expanding on a niche, next time we'll look at a company that went from offering temporary housing with air mattresses at conferences to becoming a multi-billion-dollar platform for diverse travel accommodations.
Welcome back to The Art of the Startup Pivot, the podcast series that dives deep into the moments where companies bravely changed course to find massive success. Today, we're exploring a story of incredible vision and adaptation, moving from a very niche offering to a global phenomenon.
That's right, Alex. Today we're talking about Airbnb. It's a prime example of how expanding a niche solution can lead to a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Many people know Airbnb today as a global hospitality giant, but its origins were far more humble and, frankly, quite specific.
I remember hearing bits and pieces of their early days, but I'm eager to get the full picture. So what was the initial concept for Brian Chesky, Joe Gebbia, and Nathan Blecharczyk?
The founders, Brian Chesky, Joe Gebbia, and Nathan Blecharczyk, started with a very particular problem in mind. Their initial concept revolved around providing temporary housing, specifically air mattresses, for conference attendees. Imagine that, literally offering a spare air mattress in their apartment during a design conference in San Francisco. It was a hyper-focused solution to a localized temporary need.
Air mattresses at conferences. That's incredibly niche. It highlights how many startups begin by trying to solve a very specific problem they experience themselves. But what kind of traction did they get with this, and how did they sustain themselves financially in those early days?
The early days were challenging, as they are for many startups. The source material highlights a rather creative and unconventional fundraising method. The founders even sold novelty cereal boxes to raise funds. It underscores the resourcefulness often required when you're trying to get a new concept off the ground, especially when the initial market might be too small to attract traditional investment easily. This period of scrappiness is often a precursor to a pivot.
Selling cereal boxes. Wow, that's a testament to their commitment. So, at what point did they realize that limiting themselves to air mattresses for conference attendees wasn't going to scale? And how did they transition to the Airbnb we know today?
The pivotal moment came when they recognized the broader appeal of their underlying concept. The core insight wasn't just about providing a place to sleep during a conference, it was about leveraging unused spaces and connecting people looking for unique, local experiences with hosts willing to provide them. Their decisive pivot was to move beyond that very specific niche of air mattresses for conference goers to a broader platform for all travelers seeking diverse accommodations and experiences. It was about seeing the bigger picture beyond the immediate problem they initially solved.
So they didn't abandon the core idea of peer-to-peer accommodation. They just expanded the scope dramatically. This sounds like a classic example of identifying a fundamental human need, in this case, travel and unique states, and scaling the solution.
Precisely. The pivot wasn't a complete overhaul of the initial principle, but rather an expansion of its application. They realized the value wasn't just in addressing a temporary housing shortage during specific events, but in unlocking the potential of spare rooms, apartments, and even entire homes for anyone seeking a more authentic travel experience. This strategic shift transformed them into a multi-billion-dollar hospitality enterprise. It really demonstrates that successful pivots involve decisive action, leveraging existing assets, and a willingness to abandon original visions to adapt and ultimately thrive.
It's a powerful story of seeing past the initial constraint and identifying a much larger market opportunity. It reinforces the idea that an initial hypothesis about product market fit or target audiences frequently proves incorrect. And as our source material states, approximately 80% of startups change their product or strategy before finding lasting success, and 75% of successful startups pivoted at least once before finding a viable business model. Airbnb certainly fits into that successful category.
Absolutely. Their journey from a niche solution to a global platform is a fantastic illustration of what a good pivot looks like, data-driven and based on a clear hypothesis for future success. It wasn't a desperation move, but a strategic evolution that transformed a small idea into a massive industry disruptor.
Truly inspiring. What's fascinating is how these companies pay such close attention to what their users are actually doing, even if it's not what they originally intended. It often leads them to a completely new and more successful path.
You're hitting on a key point there, Alex. Observing user behavior is absolutely critical. Sometimes the most valuable product emerges when founders keenly observe what users are truly engaged with, even if it's just one small feature. That kind of insight can strip away everything but the essence of what works, leading to explosive growth.
That's a perfect segue, Sam. Join us next time on The Art of the Startup Pivot as we explore another incredible transformation, focusing on how observing users and amplifying a core value led to the creation of one of the world's most popular social media platforms. It's the story of Burb and how it stripped away everything but its success to become Instagram. Welcome back to The Art of the Startup Pivot, the podcast that explores how entrepreneurial companies redefine themselves to achieve lasting success. Today, we're diving into a fascinating case study that truly exemplifies the power of listening to your users.
That's right, Alex. We're going to explore the remarkable transformation of Bourbon into Instagram. This story highlights a crucial lesson for any startup. Sometimes the most valuable product emerges when you simplify and focus on what your customers are actually doing, not just what you initially intended.
It's a classic example, Sam. Many aspiring founders start with a broad vision, but the market often has different plans. Tell us about Bourbon's initial concept.
Absolutely. Bourbon, co-founded by Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger, began as a much more comprehensive and ambitious application. It was designed as a location-based check-in app, incorporating various social gaming features. So it offered a lot, aiming to be a multifaceted social experience.
So a really feature-rich platform, more than just photo sharing.
Precisely. It was packed with functionality. But here's where the critical insight came in. Systrom and Krieger, like astute entrepreneurs, closely observed user behavior. They noticed that despite all the different features Bourbon offered, users were primarily engaging with one specific part of the application, the photo sharing function.
That's a huge tell. It really speaks to what our overview mentioned, that initial hypotheses about product market fit or target audiences frequently prove incorrect. This kind of direct user feedback through their actions is invaluable.
It truly is, Alex. This observation was the catalyst for their major strategic redirection. Instead of clinging to their initial broad vision, they made a decisive move. They chose to strip away almost all the other features, focusing solely on amplifying the photo sharing experience.
That must have been an incredibly challenging decision, to abandon so much development and so many original ideas.
It certainly was, and it's something many founders struggle with. Our source material highlights that successful pivots involve decisive action, leveraging existing assets, and a willingness to abandon original visions. This decisive action, focusing solely on the photo sharing aspect, led directly to the creation of Instagram.
And that transformation was, as we know, monumentally successful. It truly illustrates the importance of keenly observing user behavior to identify and amplify core value.
Indeed, Instagram quickly became one of the world's most popular social media platforms, a testament to the power of a focused, user-centric approach. This isn't an isolated incident either. Research indicates that a significant percentage of successful startups have undergone at least one major strategic change. For instance, approximately 92% of startups pivot at least once before achieving product-market fit.
That's a staggering statistic. So Bourbon's pivot wasn't a sign of failure, but rather a calculated experiment to test new hypotheses, just as the overview defines it.
Exactly. This type of pivot, driven by validated customer insights and a clear hypothesis for future success, is often referred to as a good pivot. It contrasts sharply with desperation pivots, which are born out of dwindling resources and a lack of clear direction. The source material indicates that for founders committed seriously to the pivoting process, success rates are around 75%.
And this strategic adaptation helps companies avoid exhausting resources, a key factor since running out of cash is the second leading cause of startup failure, affecting 29% of ventures.
Precisely. The founders of Bourbon demonstrated remarkable agility and a commitment to data-driven decision-making. They weren't just guessing, they were reacting to tangible evidence of what their users valued most. This approach directly addresses the top reason for startup failure, accounting for 42% of cases, which is a lack of market need for the product.
This also highlights that successful pivots often involve leveraging existing assets, in this case, the photo sharing functionality they had already built into Bourbon.
Absolutely. And the impact can be massive. We've seen similar patterns in other major companies. YouTube, for example, initially launched as a video dating service before recognizing the broader appeal of general video sharing. PayPal's shift from Palm Pilot IOUs to email payments also showcases this adaptability.
So the common thread is often recognizing an emergent, more viable use case for an existing technology or feature that wasn't initially the primary focus.
That's a perfect summation, Alex. The Instagram story is a prime example of how founders can turn perceived early missteps or a lack of traction in one area into monumental success by focusing on what truly resonates with their audience. It's a testament to agility, customer centricity, and a willingness to embrace change in the startup world. It really drives home that lesson. A pivot isn't just about changing direction. It's about making a strategic, informed decision to align with genuine market needs, often revealed by user behavior.
And the numbers strongly support this. About 75% of successful startups pivoted at least once before finding a viable business model. It's an almost universal truth in the entrepreneurial journey.
So for aspiring entrepreneurs, the lesson from Bourbon to Instagram is crystal clear. Build, observe your users intently, and be brave enough to cut and refine based on what their actions are telling you.
Precisely. It's about constant iteration and not being afraid to pivot when the data clearly points you in a new, more promising direction. Embracing the pivot is considered essential for long-term success.
A truly inspiring journey of adaptation. Thank you, Sam, for shedding light on the Instagram pivot.
My pleasure, Alex. The art of the startup pivot is truly about understanding these critical moments of transformation that define successful ventures.